Good evening. This is live. The cup runneth over. Germanicus is here. The Friends of History Debating Society begins a debate that we can't possibly contain. We're going to do our best. Discipline is impossible, but we will go from subject matter to subject matter as consistently as possible without doubling back. Venezuela, yes. The emperor himself, yes. And then Germanicus has agreed that we can have great fun talking about celebrating the once and never again Constantinople, the jewel of the solar system as long as it lasted, called today Istanbul. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. The centurions are licking their lips, or is that a second cup of wine, boys? Because they've heard of Venezuela. Something's happened in the 21st century that pleases them. Generally speaking, this would be the centurions leading a raid into an enemy fortress in order to drag out the prince or whoever is the warlord at the moment and end the fighting with the decapitation. The decision that the Trump administration made in these last hours was to decapitate partially. There are many versions of what happened in Venezuela. I choose all of them. I like no one more than any other, but I'll tell one to start with. This is an example. The Trump administration has spent weeks and weeks and months and months and months reinforcing the opinion of the vice president of Venezuela, a woman named Delcy. And that was to be the turn of the screw. That Maduro's extraction as an accused, alleged criminal would leave the office open for Delcy. And Delcy would cooperate with the Trump administration in order to move towards new elections and a peaceful transfer of power in the palace in Caracas. That's one version. And then it didn't work. And why? The airstrikes were meant to decapitate the military. A man named Petrino, Vladimir Petrino, the Minister of Defense. They missed him. Is one version. He's been on television several times, more than Delcy in the last 24, 48, 72 hours. And by missing him, they missed the turn for peaceful transition. Machado and Gonzalez, the elected leader is Gonzalez, the leader of the opposition is Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, are now sidelined. They have no easy path. Delcy has asserted her role as president by the Supreme Court of Venezuela and demanded the return of Maduro, who is in New York, Southern District, and will be arraigned within these next hours, Monday, the 5th. Arraigned as an innocent man, along with his wife. He will have an attorney. He will have a voice through his attorney. And we begin the prosecution for drug running of a man named Maduro. In the same time, this is one version. There are many others. At the same time, Petrino is said to be in charge of the country through Delcy. And they've been on television repeatedly, and they will again. What we have now is the beginning of a long, long drama. We've been through these dramas again and again in the 20th century. And those who use Vietnam, those who use Afghanistan, those who use Iraq, etc., are not wrong enough to be declared out of bounds. Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. we are in a real fix here. And we are not the same kind of empire in the same kind of splendid situation of omnipotence that we were um, at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, when the entire suite of enemies was coming apart, and when it was possible for the US, still flush with decades of Cold War spending and preparation for the big one with the Soviet Union, we had really a lot more force than we have available today. And the other powers were in rapid descent. China had not arisen, and the Soviet Union was coming apart very quickly. So we could basically do what we wanted. We did that in Iraq and Kuwait with Desert Storm. We also did it in Panama, and we put about 27,000 or so troops in a very small country, essentially abducted the leader of that country and brought him back. I think this time it was to Florida, and he spent the rest of his life in prison. But it was easy, and it was easy in large part because the U.S. had a large stake in Panama. It was culturally interwoven with the society, a lot of intermarriage. A lot of Panamanians were happy to see this guy go, and there was enough support within the ruling institutions and the military there to have a pretty good outcome. At least Panamanians would tell you that. Venezuela is a much different place. First of all, it's been deconstructed over the years of incompetent rule. It has brought in dangerous, and I mean dangerous because they are not controllable, guerrilla forces, armed groups with lots of combat experience from a 60-year-long war in Colombia. Given safe harbor in Venezuela, arrangements were made between these groups, and there are many factions within the military, and the entire ruling structure of post-Chavez Venezuela was really a kind of medieval pastiche of personal arrangements made between various factions and power centers to try and keep some kind of relative superficial stability, basically by everyone getting paid off. That kind of corruption has led not only to deep discontent, but also a kind of massive decline in GDP and quality of life. So people are ready for change, but the ability to institute such a change would either require something like 1 million American troops to come in and do the kind of thing that they were supposed to do and failed in Iraq, or to keep the current regime going, in which case it would still be a kind of corrupt arrangement, like the U.S. supporting dictators past, like Somoza in Nicaragua or Rios Montt in Guatemala, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know how long that would last either. However, if the institutional forces, the whole pastiche, really turns against the U.S. and creates a situation where we have to choose to go in and dismantle it, that would be a very difficult situation. That would look a lot more like Iraq. And the Iraq thing was impossible for the U.S., and yet it was nothing like the situation that we laid on Russia and Ukraine. In other words, the Iraq resistance and insurgencies there did not have the same kind of support that Ukraine has had against Russia. And in this sense, you don't need to have Russia or China trying to infiltrate military advisors and weapons, which would be very difficult for them and very escalatory. But the terrain of Venezuela and the capacity to resist because of the heavily armed nature of all the armed groups there, would make it a very difficult proposition. I mean, you have all the favelas in Caracas and Maracaibo. It would be a mess, a gigantic mess. And it's a much bigger country than Iraq and much, much more populous. It would be another sinkhole for the United States.
We're in it, Germanicus. The centurions recognize that we've taken on one too many challenges at the same time. The Middle East is far from resolved, and in all its parts, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, I could go on, Istanbul itself, certainly Tehran and its ambitions are thwarted but not ended. And then we have Ukraine and the fear along this NATO frontier from the Arctic to the Black Sea.
Yeah.
And at home, we have to deal with the fact that we've got a fractious electorate. Fractious is meant to be Tony, okay? So,
well, it's not supporting this adventure, and there's already a poll in, and Mr. Trump is way behind in terms of support on this one. I mean, the old, or rather late medieval cliche, hoist to his own petard.
yes,
Meaning you put a mine up against a door or a gate to blow it off, and it blows up while you're hooking it on. That is essentially what we've done here, because the entire operation, the entire exercise, whether it is the current one in Venezuela or what we have done in other places, and that includes going back to Venezuela, going back to Afghanistan and Iraq, but what we did in Somalia in the 90s, and we're still doing in Somalia, what we did against the Houthi, the strikes in Syria, then of course the magnificent bit of theater against Iran. All of these activities are meant to be a kind of theater that will achieve a goal of creating authority in people's mind that the U.S. is great, the U.S. can do anything, it merely has to wave its hand and great things happen. And that is falling apart at the moment. We may recover, but the fact is, if you rely on theater and lots of theater involving military force, that theater has to sometimes do impossible things. And that seems to be where we are today. In other words, if you want to go and simply make a demonstration, such as we did against Iran, well, that can happen. And you can shape the narrative with some help actually from Iran itself, and basically get people to believe that you pulled off some miracle, some incredible bit of stage business. But it's not going to work in a situation like Venezuela. There are too many variables. It's too complex, and it's too big of a challenge to wave your wand and make things disappear in a hat.
we don't have enough of the chronology to know exactly what happened from the decision to go till the claim that Maduro was extracted. We don't have a lot of detail. We do have the general understanding that military force does not end a drama. It creates the conditions for it to expand.
Well, one thing we can say is that I think the U.S. went in, when I say the U.S., I mean all the elements that were engaged in the operation. But when Mr. Trump decided to unleash these elements on Venezuela, we were savvy enough and honest enough with ourselves to identify those elements of power that we still fully understood and were supremely good at. So we deployed the Delta Force. We deployed not simply aircraft, but the entire web, network, constellation of sensors and integration of information and data that could be used to pull this off. And it was impressive. But that's essentially what the limits of American military power are today. We're not in a position to go toe to toe with a major power. We're not in a position to fight a major insurgency. And we're not in a position even to effectively launch a air bombardment that might bring a force to its knees. We did that in Iraq against ISIS at the very end of our military engagement there. But we did that not only with the full support of the puppet Iraqi government that we'd installed, but also the people doing the dying, fighting in Mosul, were Iraqi soldiers, and we were just providing the artillery and air support, intelligence, and all those sorts of things. And that is not, we don't have at this point the kind of support on the ground in Venezuela and a big enough footprint, social military footprint there to go in and create a regime. We're really dependent on what's there, and what's there could get us off the hook if they decide to make a deal with us. But the what's there is so fractious and so unstable that I'm not sure that we can get them to do that. Plus, all of those elements, military, the guerrillas there from Colombia, they can decide, oh no, it'd be more to our advantage to actually resist, to fight the U.S. If that happens, then we really don't have any options.
And 120 years of history of intervening in Latin America are a weight on the shoulders of every columnist who's now going to write about Venezuela.
Yeah.
They'll have to do their homework, and they'll find different elements, because we've made all the mistakes 2 or 3 times in 120, 130 years. And there is no end to the mistakes that you can make. The one that comes to my mind, because I read about it extensively for a while, was the punitive expedition led by John Pershing.
Oh, yes. Right.
In 1916 to 1917. Actually, the January of 16, riding into Mexico, claiming that Carranza, the president, gave permission, which he maybe did, chasing Pancho Villa, but at the same time coming up against elements of the Mexican military that found it more than rude an invasion by the American army out of Texas. That intervention, of course, was a predicate for the intervention in the First War. Wilson pulled them out of Mexico and sent Pershing, because he had French, immediately to Paris. So I remind us, Germanicus, that Venezuela can be a predicate to something much larger.
Yes, but the main sort of legacy I see in the scores of American interventions in North America and the Caribbean is that they were typically short, and they involved small forces. And we occupied Santo Domingo twice, Haiti twice or more, Nicaragua in the 1920s, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. But we never, every single one of them, including Just Cause under H.W. Bush, all of those were relatively quick. The Mexican War itself was a very short affair.
A couple of junior officers named Sam Grant and some guy named Lee in the Mexican.
That's right, and Jackson. I mean, but the Spanish-American War was very short and snappy. Um, I'm not sure that we are in a position now to even begin to entertain the kind of impossible guerrilla war that could ensue, especially with the last 60 years from Vietnam onwards. The American experience has been littered by the corpses, by the loss of reputation, the disgrace of all of these unresolved defeats that have been inflicted on the U.S. I don't know that we're ready for another one of those.
How dangerous. We've got young people who want to know, Germanicus. We lived through it. How dangerous 13 days. That's how dangerous. That's how dangerous.
Well,
The ignorance of the ex-com that met with Jack Kennedy and the ignorance of the Presidium that met with Nikita Khrushchev, that was the end right then. It didn't happen.
Mm.
And that was Havana. And I note, because there's some kind of irony going on here, that Marco Rubio, the son of refugees from Cuba, went on NBC this morning and said, Cuba is also a challenge.
Well, we've been at war essentially with Cuba since Castro failed to take orders from us. And
apparently the bite of the apple that is Venezuela is just warming up in Washington.
Yes, and this is a neuralgia we're going to have to deal with. But I'm afraid you're right that the ignorance that you noted in 1962 and much earlier and throughout the American experience is still with us. We have no real understanding of how to create successful and enduring relationships in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. And
let us remind ourselves that we are Roman citizens and we have doubts about the emperor in the 21st century. So let's turn to our doubts. There's too much to say about Latin America. We're just beginning. It's a much more comfortable topic because we have such deep and documented history, which we do not have in the Arabian Peninsula. But we have it here, and we'll come back to this. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. We're in Londinium, of course, by the Thames, of course. It's wintry, of course. It's very cold. It's much too cold for this time of year, early January 92 AD. Domitian is in Rome, thankfully. The Roman Empire is secure and about to have a really good century, and it'll have many more centuries. And we'll speak to the success of the Roman Empire, which is a city called Constantinople. However, right now we're going to turn to the Emperor Trump, who in the last 48 hours has demonstrated mortality. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor, but as Gaius, I'm in Londinium. It is the beginning of 92 AD under the Emperor Domitian. We're very far from Rome. We're thankful for that. Our subject matter this week is obliging us to not only speak of the American Empire, which is built on the foundations of the Roman Empire, but also the American Emperor, who now and again evidences his seniority. Then the more clinical word for that is mortality. And over these last hours, what has been evident is that Mr. Trump is fully 79 years old. Not in his ability to keep up with young people. He is competitive. But the remarks that he makes on air suggest incoherence, indiscipline, and a demand to be the center of attention. Example, Trump talking to the Atlantic magazine. This is right now, within hours. If she doesn't do what's right, she is going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. What? He's talking about the president of Venezuela. That is a mortal threat. The president of Venezuela, who the Financial Times calls Delcy Rodriguez. The reason there'll be some confusion about names here is that Venezuela is one of the countries that practices a first name, a family name, and then the other family name, your mother's name. So there can be two sounding ends. Her name is Delcy to me. She is the vice president, now secured by the Supreme Court of Venezuela as the acting president, the vice president. And Emperor Trump threatens her. In addition, Mr. Rubio, Secretary of State, goes on to say that the president's remarks about we're going to run Venezuela. Mr. Rubio said, it's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regard to this, meaning the fate of Venezuela and the oil in Venezuela. That's also incoherent, and Marco Rubio has no excuse of extreme age. But I want to stay with the emperor. The emperor is evidencing also an inability to speak softly. Everything is a threat. And there's reason to believe that in these last hours, he's made intemperate remarks that give away some of the thinking that's been going on for weeks by the diplomats and the military, not only of the United States, but other countries. So I come to you, Germanicus, again. The president's opponents have concentrated on his health. I'm not talking about his health. I think he's a healthy 79 years old. At 79, you don't run an empire by staying up all the time and talking all the time on mic of policy. You don't do that. But the emperor demonstrates his reluctance to delegate. And that means that he's wandering into policy every time he speaks. Threatening the vice president, now president of Venezuela, does not take us a step closer to resolution. It suggests that there's more to come. How do you hear it?
Part of the problem with an emperor system, and the reason that I have been calling it that for so many years, is that the office itself exalts the individual holding that office to a degree that their own balance of mind cannot keep at bay. In other words, it takes over. And part of the process of the imperial office is the transformation, the metamorphosis of the individual into something more, where the president, or in the case of Roman reality, the emperor becomes the embodiment of the nation. He becomes not a supernatural or divine figure, but something nonetheless still mystical, with immense powers and responsibilities, for sure, but also a kind of empowering that sets that person apart from regular people. And the reality distortion field in general in Washington, in which people take some office, they get swept away by having power. And power is the word that is used. It's the coinage, currency of all communication in Washington. Whether you have power, people don't talk as they should about social status or even rank. They talk about power, and of course, there is no such thing as power. People simply have the authority of the office for as long as they hold it. But it's much bigger than that. And this is true of any imperial city and any imperial court, is that the rank and the sense of force behind it, that you now have some force, makes people do really crazy things. And with Trump, it's much, much worse. Not only is he the holder of the highest office, which in itself is an office that is unique and has no rival in the firmament of the American government, but he has endured this crushing odyssey in which the other side was out to get him, to essentially kill him for years, and he survived that, and he's constantly under assault. And it I think adds to what you could call a transmogrification. So not only is he transformed and elevated, but he's also become paranoid and more desperately focused on having his way and exerting his will. And it becomes almost something out of one of those great Greek plays where he's so changed by the office, and at the same time he feels the desperation of age. He feels the bony hand on his shoulder. He has things he has to do, but he is enthralled by, in other words, he's in the thrall of this need to exert his greatness, his force, his singularity, and to bend the world to his will. And this is the way the office transforms someone, but the way also that it weakens their grip on actual reality. It's a kind of cognitive dissonance.
Our European allies are alarmed. The Financial Times on Saturday, within hours of the revelation of the operation, used the word kidnapped about the Maduros.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going downhill from there. Kidnapped is a crime. Worst of crimes. Because you're threatening murder.
Well, this is something, kind of a subset of what I was saying. In other words, when you are a semi-divine figure as emperor, then you feel not only free to, but also you feel it necessary to be stern with enemies and with those who refuse to obey you. And I think that this is in full force now with Mr. Trump. And he talks about these, I don't know what to call them, antagonists, people like Maduro or others, as though they were to be expunged and wiped out. And of course, there's a precedence for this too, going back to Saddam Hussein. And you saw it with Noriega, and it's a kind of representation of these peoples, namely the smaller states in Latin America, as being inferiors, and their feistiness or their unwillingness to do as they're told makes them, they need to be dealt with sternly. And you see some of this with the more titularly equal vassals of the U.S., the European states, where Mr. Trump has treated them with contempt in front of the camera. And this is going to really boomerang. It's the kind of behavior that got Roman emperors defenestrated, shall we say.
let's add a detail here. The Kremlin was neutral in its first remark from Mr. Peskov. Brotherly Venezuela. This is before we had some clarity about whether Pedrino, the defense minister, was alive or not.
Right.
His first name is Vladimir. It tells you where his sympathies are.
Well,
yes. It just happens a lot of Spanish guys running around have the name Vladimir. All right. However, since then, the Kremlin has been more focused. Germanicus, you and I grew up in the First Cold War. There are whole directorates who Moscow is ready to lend to Caracas. Whole directorates that just show up if they're not already in the airplane on their way. Moscow has Washington in a bear trap.
They have the ability to make things hurt even more. That's right. And this is an extra dimension to the problem we face, or the briar patch that we're now in, is that we did all of these things to Russia over Ukraine. We essentially we put our directorates into Ukraine, and we subverted, and we out to take Russia down. And we're in a vulnerable position because both China and Russia can do things that we'll have difficulty dealing with. Not only will they hurt, but they won't be things that we can directly respond to without escalation, which is dangerous.
There's no evidence that the emperor is capable of responding to this level of risk. No evidence. You know the old metaphor that your mom always told you about, the bull in a china shop?
Yeah.
That's inadequate for what the emperor is demonstrating.
It is. It's a very powerful contrast to say, not just Xi, but also us, and especially Mr. Putin, because he has, his words are so carefully chosen. He makes such reasonable and yet powerful arguments, and he shows in every gesture and comportment of his presence a restraint and a legalism that is in the starkest contrast to Mr. Trump. And what that means, I think, over time, with each new incident, is that Russia gains in stature. So does China. The U.S. loses its authority. The U.S. becomes not simply a laughing stock, but the danger to the rest of humanity. That is a kind of an emerging trope, which is not just taking form; it's becoming part of the world's discourse now.
One more detail, and it comes up again and again in Europe now. You'll see it all this week. The editorial in the Financial Times, the second day, mentions Taiwan and Ukraine as direct results of what's happening in Venezuela. Direct. No around the bend, no use your imagination. As Venezuela goes, so goes Ukraine and Taiwan.
Well, certainly there is a quid pro quo that's been around, right, simmering below the surface for 5 or 6 years about, we'll give you Ukraine if you give us Venezuela. That may end up being the bargain that we have to accept. And maybe that's all right. With Taiwan, I think the situation is more fraught because it's quite clear now where Japan stands vis-a-vis Taiwan. I would imagine that the idea of taking Taiwan is out of the question. But at the same time, the ability of the U.S. to have any kind of standing when it comes to the disposition of Taiwan means that there will have to be, and I would guess there will be, a kind of three-way resolution involving Taiwan, Japan, and China, where they'll come to some kind of agreement rather than go to war.
Let us praise Constantinople. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. The centurions are satisfied for the moment. We'll have many more weeks of this, guys. We have gotten ourselves into a well, let's translate it for them. We've crossed the Rhine and we're in the German forest. What do you think is going to happen? Okay. We come back and we'll praise Constantinople excessively, but it deserves it. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is Debating Society. I am John Batchelor in Londinium, as Gaius and Germanicus is here, and the centurions are listening in to our praise of Constantinople. In their time, the city does not exist, 92 AD now. It will, however, spring full-blown in the beginning of the third, at the end of the third and the beginning of the fourth century. It will be the result of persecution of Christians and the useful dimension chosen by a man named Constantine to say, I am Christian, they are not, because of what he claims is a miracle of faith by the Milvian Bridge, battling what he identifies as the pagans, when in fact this is a tussle for the emperor's crown. At that point in Roman history, things had become so bad there's not one emperor, there are not two emperors, there are not three emperors. There are four emperors and four more behind them ready to be nominated. You had an Augustus and a Caesar. Constantine emerges and he vows to build a city here in the Bosphorus at this crossroads between Europe and Asia. It's his heir, Constantinicus, who actually does the first of the building. But several hundred years later, this is a city that has nothing comparable in the 21st century. It was a city of bureaucrats, apparatchiks, who ran the empire, who understood how to make money for the empire and to sustain the courts, sustain the banks, sustain credit, sustain the military, sustain the navy. Emperor after emperor, they could have their particular prejudices, but the empire was sustained by Constantinople, the city. And when various enemies and friends would show up at Constantinople for the first time, for example, the Arab armies who marched on Constantinople, this is the rise of Islam. When they reached the walls of Constantinople, they couldn't believe how big they were. The height of the towers. It was a triple wall, and there was no navy on earth that could navigate the tides outside the city except for the Roman navy. Everybody else would be swept by and not be able to land anywhere. When friends arrived at Constantinople, they were, well, gobsmacked is a wonderful word from the 20th century Britain. It might be even older than that. I've not checked it. But in any event, the height of the churches, especially Hagia Sophia, the only explanation they had for Hagia Sophia at the time was that it was a miracle that anything could be that tall, that dome with the angels painted on it. And when Hagia Sophia was built first as thankfulness for ending the Nika riots, it sprang from horse racing. Okay, fine. Everybody's got a weakness. In any event, it was filled with gold and silver trim. It glowed when you went inside of it. It lit up when the sun hit it. All that was stripped out, of course, by subsequent plundering by the Crusades. But for those several hundred years, entering into Hagia Sophia, a church, was to enter into a stairway to heaven. That's my praise, Germanicus, and you know this part of the story much better than I. What would you feature about Constantinople?
what made Constantinople so divine in the eyes of those who lived there and those who came was its perfection. I mean, in many ways, like the Hagia Sophia, the Romans had a word, the Greek Romans, mimesis, meaning that the Hagia Sophia was a reflection of heaven on earth, or the divine come down to earth. And the whole city was like that in the sense that it had been planned to perfection. Constantinople was everything the old Romans back in Roma did not have. They had a messy city, a city that grew by happenstance, piled on top of itself, jostling and huge, but at the same time, not easy to get around, and it didn't flow. And in Constantinople, it was a fully designed city. It was a balanced whole. I mean, the walls, the great avenues, the series of fora, the Golden Gate, the Hippodrome, the incredible imperial palaces, of which there were at least three major ones, and it was again a dream of a dream. And I think in functional, practical terms, for about 500 years, from the 6th century to the 11th century, Constantinople was Western civilization. In other words, there was everything outside of Constantinople had been atomized. And by atomized, I mean you might have an atom in southern Italy in the form of a monastery where there were some texts. And you might have another one up in Northumberland that would soon be razed by Vikings and brought to the ground. There was nothing in the Western universe that could amount to civilization that could preserve it. So it really was the entirety of what was left. It was in functional, again, and practical terms, it was the medieval equivalent to Helm's Deep in the Tolkien saga, Lord of the Rings. It was the last stand of civilization, and it was magnificent. And it unlike Helm's Deep, it could not be breached, not until the very end. And
by friends, supposedly friends.
Yes, stab in the back. But of course, this is the deeper sub narrative within Rome. Always a struggle between Latins and Greeks, and when the Greeks were dominant, the Latins were envious. And when the Latins were dominant, the Greeks had to find a way to get back in, which they did. And this was a seesaw struggle going back to Pyrrhus, even farther perhaps. But you mentioned Constantius. He had a triumph in Rome around, I think, 350 or so. And already the inhabitants of Rome were filled with envy and rage that this so-called Greekling was their emperor. And that resentment festered and carried forward to the Great Schism and then ultimately to the Fourth Crusade. And it really, Rome did itself in because essentially it had a kind of bipolar tension between the Greek and the Roman, and that's never been resolved.
You remind me of how Rome was sacked. It's a fun story.
Well,
right, from 410 AD.
Yeah.
We know it as the city of God. That is the cultural artifact that weighs on the 21st century as it has ever since Augustine.
Right.
He had been to Rome for a few years, mostly in Milan when he traveled to Italy. But he was a North African in a city called Hippo, where he was bishop. He grew up with the North African tongue, and his Latin was various. Mostly he spoke is North African tongue and Greek. And the sacking of Rome, which led to him writing the City of God, was an accident. A man named Alaric, a Goth. The Goths were barbarians, yes, they were a tribe, but they were dislocated by the Huns, the famous Huns. And they kept looking for a place to live and settle down, but they had more fun, at least Alaric did, not working for money, but showing up outside of a city and saying, listen, that's a nice city you've got there. Would be very, very unhappy if something bad happened to it. And the town fathers would pay him. And that worked for a while. And he tried it on Rome and it was successful. And then he tried it on Rome more and more time. And the geniuses of the fathers of Rome at that period, no, we're not going to pay him. Well, what do you think happened? That's how Rome got sacked.
Well, it was a very polite sack. I mean, the sacking by the Vandals later in the 450s was much worse. And in fact, the guy who did the worst damage to Rome was probably the last Roman emperor to visit Rome, Constans II. He stripped all the zinc roof tiles. That's how poor the Roman Empire was at that point. And he brought them back to Constantinople, of course. Now, the thing with the Visigoths is that the Romans had a profound misunderstanding of what the Visigoths wanted. And that was ultimately destructive to Rome because they looked down on the Visigoths as being barbarians, obviously. And they said, well, you can come in, cross the Danube, get away from the Huns, and we'll give you nice farmland that you can till as good Roman subjects. They cavilled at that. They didn't want a farmland. They wanted to live in the fabled cities of the Greco-Roman world. They wanted to be, equus class, really. They wanted to be Romans, and they wanted to all the good things of Roman life. And, it's very ironic, but that sacking Rome was part of the odyssey that eventually led to a reconciliation between the Visigoths and the Romans, because after beating them a couple times, or more than that, the Roman emperor, I can't remember, it was another Constantine, I think, was able to chase them into southern France, where he settled them in what we now call Aquitaine, and they had the bounteous little place to live they wanted, and they remained good Roman allies for over another century. In fact, the Visigoths fought shoulder to shoulder with the last great Roman general, Aetius, at the battle that finally defeated the Huns.
Germanicus, let us stop because I hadn't thought through that this was going to upset the centurions.
Right.
We gave them Constantinople as a dream that is in the future. And then we very carefully deconstructed Rome, which they're
Yes, that's true.
they're veterans of defending Rome. And gentlemen, consider this: the residents of Constantinople were Romans. That was part of your success. Rome itself never disappeared, but Constantinople was Roman. And the ability to maintain the laws, the banks, the military, especially the navy that it invented after you conquered Carthage, all of those institutions continued to shine in Constantinople, and meritocracy shined in Constantinople. What the 20th century provided was meritocracy for the American Empire. That's an example of Roman institutional thinking. And at the end in Constantinople, when it was sacked not by the Arabs, not by the Turks, not by the Huns, it was sacked by Christians, Nicene Creed Christians from France and Germany and Britain. That's who sacked it. That's who burned, who set fire on it, who stripped it of gold and silver. There's a story told, 1204, of one of the best of the merit-worthy bureaucrats who'd come from a small village in Anatolia. And because he was bright and worked hard and studied all the time, rose up in the apparatus that extracted money in exchange for the army and services throughout the empire, trade. He was ransacked. His house was taken from him and set on fire. His family was gathered together, and they had to leave the city. They were ordered out of the city. And as they passed the gate to leave the city, the Crusaders stood there plundering them, making them strip down to make sure they weren't carrying gold or silver with them, and assaulting their daughters and wives in front of them. That's what they did as they retreated from Constantinople. And that was the end of the city for the sacrifice you gentlemen made, right then, 1204. The Crusaders then took over, but they were not adequate to the institution. The dream of Rome that is yours continued, and it continues now in the 21st century in the American Empire. And all the mistakes that Germanicus and I speak of, that's the nature of history. You speak of the mistakes, but in between, and I'll end this, Germanicus, and ask for your comment. No sacrifice was too much to build a city like Constantinople. Nobody's built anything like it since then. Your comment.
They haven't. And the really ironic and tragic part is the struggle between the Latin and the Greek continues today. If America is the inheritor of the Latin West, then surely Moscow is the inheritor of the Greek East in religious terms, as well as the concept itself.
And it's self-aware. Putin's self-aware of this.
Oh, absolutely.
And I believe that it is necessary for NATO to think about it. NATO is a Nicene Creed organization, even though it might not know the Nicene Creed. And the icon worshiping in the East and the iconoclasm of the West, well, therein lies the story. Germanicus, yes. Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius John Batchelor. Domitian didn't hear a word we said. Gosh, the 1st century AD seems a long time ago. We're not going to the theater tonight. It's too cold. The theater shut down for this cold snap we're living in. Maybe the 40s next week. We don't know. Thank you for listening. Live, Londinium. I'm John Batchelor.